Okay, so there has been a lot of bad news this week. But we're going to start by talking about the announcement from Sony CEO Jim Ryan that he's going to be leaving the company in March 2024. In previous interviews, he cited a pretty demanding work schedule, basically like 2 weeks in America, a week in Tokyo, a week in Europe, and he lives in Europe. It's kind of been grinding him down. He's decided to retire after 30 years with Sony Interactive Entertainment. I'm going to go to you first, Oliver, on your reactions to this, because if we look back at Ryan's tenure, essentially PlayStation has never been in better health from a financial perspective and in terms of what they've achieved in the market and establishing PlayStation as the dominant console brand. Certainly on the more sort of powerful side of the equation, a pretty impressive body of work. But I'm curious what you think about this, and also, I guess, about the legacy that's been left behind.
Yeah, his tenure wasn't actually super long. He started in 2019. So if you think about it, the main project that he really had oversight over during that period would have been the PlayStation 5. And obviously the PlayStation 5 has been extremely successful. I think probably people online have used this as a bit of an opportunity to take a bit of a referendum on Sony's direction over the past 5 or 10 years, which has sort of gravitated towards these really big budget games with massive development budgets made by kind of premier AAA studios. And obviously that's come with a lot of success, but I think it hasn't come without controversy as well. I think they've had an extremely good track record with their first party releases, a track record that certainly I think Microsoft is a little bit envious of. So it's a bit of a hard strategy to critique too much, but it is a very safe strategy. And they're kind of a bit of a second mover on a lot of things like game subscriptions and doing GAAS titles. So I think it's mostly a very positive legacy from the perspective of Sony's stockholders for sure. But it's also something that is going a bit still down the straight and narrow path of what Sony's been successful in.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, if you look at their first party output, it's been pretty much untouchable, I think. I mean, people look at Days Gone as an example of a title that didn't quite match the same standards, but I actually think it's a brilliant game. And if that's your low point, holy crap, I think they've done a fantastic job with their first party efforts. And obviously, when we start to see those first party titles arriving on PC, which I think is another initiative that Jim Ryan has kind of initiated, there's been some success there. And when we see Sony games arriving on PC, it's actually a bit of an event, which I think is testament to the quality that first party unit has achieved. Alex, what are your thoughts about this departure?
I would say a very successful career at the head. Obviously, Jim Ryan's been at Sony for a lot longer than that. Before then, almost since like the dawn of time of Sony.
Dawn of PlayStation,
yeah,
for sure.
PlayStation for sure. That's what I meant. And I would say releasing the PS5 in the midst of COVID-19 and still having it be as successful as it is. Obviously, there's a lot of inertia there with how successful the PS4 was, but there's no reason why people couldn't have also made the decision at the initial point in time then say, oh, I'll actually get an Xbox, or I'll stick with Switch, or I'll stick with PC, etc. Making the PlayStation 5 successful in spite of the economic and world turmoil that was COVID-19 and into now, I think at points that Jim Ryan did a really, really good job. I would, though also at the same time, I would really like to highlight the fact that there's been a serious change in Sony, even before Jim Ryan started as being at the head of the gaming division company there, like the gravitation towards more prestige games, the closing of certain studios, the lack of emphasis actually on the Japanese market, which it's hard to almost fault Sony for that at times, because there's a general change in the Japanese market, more people are gravitating towards phones, Switch, and PC, oddly enough, in the Japanese market these days. So them turning away from there and having less Japanese developed games and less just Japanese focused games is not so surprising, but it's also just points to the fact that this is a much more market driven, a much more Western orientated Sony than ever before in history, I would say. And that has made it so that a lot of the premier titles that are coming out, they're ambitious from a visual design perspective and these are huge games that everyone's celebrating, things like Marvel Spider-Man, Horizon, but they're not exactly, I would say, ambitious from like the creative, or, I don't know if we would get these days something like Gravity Rush, or we would get Shadow of the Colossus in a modern Sony, like something that's really weird and out there. Death Stranding is the last one where I thought, like, this is a strange game. It feels like a PlayStation game in that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's hard to say how much that is Jim Ryan's legacy versus that was what was already happening at Sony at some point in time, even before he took the mantle. But that is definitely where we are right now. So I'm a little bit hard to be upset about Jim Ryan's legacy in that aspect, because I feel like that's kind of where the entire market and Sony's been going for a while now. Almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The question is whether, obviously there is this concept that PlayStation isn't the melting pot of gaming ideas that it once was. If you go back specifically to PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2 era, they were putting out diversity is the word I'd use to sum it up. The amount of games they were putting out, the amount of new ideas that they were sort of instigating in, it was just phenomenal. But we're not really seeing that anymore. But obviously the success is there that justifies this thing. Whether that's down to Jim Ryan, it's up for debate, because I'd argue that a lot of this began right at the beginning of the PlayStation 4 era.
Right.
Jim Ryan was about there, but he wasn't the head guy at that point. Oliver, what are your thoughts about that? Obviously, we've seen a very marked change in terms of where Sony is heading with its first party stuff. Do you think we've lost something? I mean, from my perspective, when PlayStation 5 arrived and we had the Asobi game on the console, it was an actual highlight to actually see something that was fresh, exciting, and was doing things with the controller that since then nobody else has really done. And it's kind of that I miss about the Sony of the past. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think it's a little tough nowadays because the economics of games, I think, are so slanted towards these big tentpole AAA franchises, and it's hard to innovate within that framework a little bit. And I just think when Sony is looking at greenlighting a big game and committing hundreds of $millions of development resources towards a title, I think they're really conservative. Not necessarily in totally bad ways, because obviously they have very established franchises and they have a lot of very talented people working on established games and established mechanics to make them as good as possible. Like I could see Sony doing more in the kind of AA space for sure. I think they should probably be doing more in that space. I think what they've done with VR is quite good as well. Maybe that's a space they could push more interesting concepts in as well, because that's certainly what they did last generation of PSVR, not so much PSVR 2 this generation, unfortunately. But it's a little tough. I think it's just tough to justify the economics of AAA game development while pushing out interesting new concepts. I kind of think that needs to be incubated in lower budget titles first, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, let's take some supporter questions on this. The first one from Alex R. Davies. Jim Ryan has just announced his retirement. Did you cross paths much? What were your favourite interactions with him, and what are some of the places where we see his legacy in the video game tech of today? I can actually say I've never met Jim Ryan, right? 32 years in the business. And I've never met Jim Ryan. It's just Sony is an interesting company because it has a very sort of rigid corporate structure, right? So Jim Ryan speaks to the people that Jim Ryan needs to speak to, right? So, I understand that he speaks to our colleagues at gamesindustry.biz because that's really the kind of journalists Jim Ryan would be speaking to, right? When it comes to who speaks to us, it's typically the tech guys at Sony. And, that's where we get our stories and our content from. And I guess that kind of makes sense. I suppose the concept that we haven't sort of even met him in events and stuff is interesting. But, yeah, it's just not really been, it's not really a part of our beat, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
You can contrast that with Phil Spencer, who's actually, deeply invested in all levels of the business and wants to interact with every part of the business as well. I mean, there were some things from Tokyo Game Show last week where he attended and was talking to fans. I mean, that's Phil's approach, and it's not really Jim Ryan's approach. I'm not saying one's good and one's bad, but they're just different approaches. So yeah, there aren't really any there aren't any favourite interactions because there aren't any interactions, which I find quite interesting in retrospect. But, I never met Andrew House either, or, any of those guys. This next question from Rich, which isn't me, not really a question, just an observation that there have been several high-profile resignations recently. Scott Herkelman at AMD, Jim Ryan at Sony, and Ryan Shrout at Intel, all within the span of 72 hours. Yeah, I mean, I think there is sort of slightly different levels of importance there. I mean, Jim Ryan ran the company. You can't really say the same for
Scott and
Ryan and Scott. Yeah, but indeed, it is interesting. This one from Matt Bertram. Hey DF! Exclamation point! With Jim Ryan announcing his upcoming retirement this week, in what new directions would you like to see the PlayStation brand head in under future leadership? Well, this is the thing, right? I mean. Obviously, a lot of change has happened within the PlayStation structure, the ramifications of which we've yet to see, right? Because there's the concept of Sony making some sort of investment in the cloud. We're starting to see beta tests of PlayStation 5 titles running on the cloud. We've not had access to that yet. But one of our supporters has and says it's quite good. And I think probably more interesting and a bit more of a red flag, bearing in mind our personal sort of how we like to game. I think you mentioned it earlier, Oliver, the GAAS, Games as a Service investment, where this is something where Sony is looking to invest and is investing heavily. They've bought Bungie. They've got lots of other titles in development. Games as a Service. This could well be what could make or break the Ryan legacy, right? Thoughts?
Wow. I mean, based on what we said, I don't know, Oliver.
I think you just don't really.
I think it's interesting that Sony as a first party is trying to get into GAAS because that's typically multi-platform stuff. Which is what I think we're seeing from Bungie's Marathon, right? But I don't think all of Sony's first-party games as a service titles are reaching multi-platform. Right. It doesn't really feel like a supernatural fit for a first-party studio to be working on, because obviously those are games that are meant to, I think, bring people into a platform, and I think are meant to drive sales and engagement and sales on a console. That kind of bleeds into other products. So I don't really see that as being the purview of like a big exclusive title. I'm a little skeptical of their ability to achieve that.
Right. That's an interesting thought. The concept, I mean, obviously Naughty Dog are working on a multiplayer game, which is believed to be a Last of Us Factions evolution. You can't really see that arriving on the Xbox, can you?
No.
Or
No.
PC, possibly.
Definitely PC. I think it'll be day and date, actually, with PC.
You think that would be interesting? That would be a
that's what I
first for
imagine.
Sony. Yeah, I think the games as a service thing is the big gambit which Jim Ryan has made, and it's too early to tell whether it's going to pay off. If it does pay off, well, I think one thing which I noted is that they have a huge level of investment in their first-party titles.
Right.
Huge. And the question is whether the return, I mean, obviously they're profitable. The question is whether the returns are actually sort of justifying the huge amount of resources and money being poured into them. And maybe games as a service is seen as attempting to bring balance maybe to the first-party portfolio in terms of having, consistent revenues. That kind of makes sense to me. I think the thing that's going to be challenging about it is, well, we've seen this week, we'll talk about it shortly, with the closure of Hyenas. It's a game that was created by Creative Assembly. It's never going to come out. It seems to be the case that these games as a service, I mean, we saw it with Avengers. You can invest a huge amount of money, but also lose a huge amount of money. So the question is whether the games are going to actually be profitable, whether this gambit is going to pay off. Right?
Yeah, I would say actually, I mean, obviously massive AAA games that are really expensive don't always work out. But I do think chasing the games as a service model is even more dangerous than like if you're investing similar amounts of money as you would, for example, in like a Spider-Man 2 game, and maybe even more time, because Hyena was in development for apparently, I think it was something like 5 or 6 years. which is hard to imagine. If you're doing that, these games flop like incredibly, like almost immediately. They can flop. They just don't get the traction at all on Steam. No one cares. They play the early access version and they say, this is too buggy, I don't care, and they don't ever return to it, and the entire game just goes on. In the case of Hyenas, it's not even released ever. It's just not even released. And I feel like that is an area, I know this is something that they're going to be expanding into, and we'll be seeing more of it over time. The seeds have been laid. But it's also really terrifying, I would say, because these games do not have a great record. Everyone wants to be Bungie. Everyone wants to be Fortnite, but not everyone can be. And there's only like a limited space for spending and consumer time, I think, for all these GAAS titles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We got this comment from Eric Benoit. It seems Jim Ryan might be remembered for saying, who wants to play PS1 and PS2 games? They look ancient. What do you think he should be remembered for? I mean, navigating the transition from PS4 to PS5 during the pandemic could not have been easy. Yeah, I mean, this is the pandemic thing, right? Once you could never plan for it. Right, obviously. So basically things were in motion before the pandemic. I mean, March 2020, I was planning to get on a plane to talk to Mark Cerny about PlayStation 5. Literally everything changed within weeks, within days even. So basically a lot of the stuff happening with PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X was in motion. There was obviously going to be some choppy waters in terms of stuff like supply chains and actually getting the products out, and the concepts that at any moment all of those massive factories in China could shut down. That's the sort of crazy stuff. But in terms of the products and the games, a lot of the work had been done. Obviously, work from home and game development, that's another thing that was a massive challenge at the time. But ultimately, on the flip side, the concept of lockdown meant that, everybody was at home and wanted things to do. So, it was kind of like a bonus in a way for people who were making entertainment at the time, that suddenly your audience was massive. I mean, it's a crazy way of looking at it, but that's the way it was. So, I think there must have been some incredible crisis management that happened during the thick of it, when you literally didn't know what was going to be happening from one week to the next. So, that was really interesting. In terms of overall strategy, though, I'm not sure much changed. In terms of this comment, that it always gets attached to Jim Ryan, the who wants to play PS1 and PS2 games, they look ancient. I think it sort of speaks to a general thing that we've always been critical about Sony, which is basically the stewardship of a library of games stretching back for 5 generations and 3 decades now, and it kind of should be treated better. We thought there might be something interesting happening with the premium tier on the PlayStation Plus subscription service, where you get these classic games delivered every month, but the emulators weren't great, and the amount of classic games being released isn't exactly voluminous, is it? So I don't know. I think there's work to do there for whoever his eventual successor will be. But in the meantime, I think Jim can look back and say, well, PlayStation has never been in better health. PlayStation 5 is just been a juggernaut in terms of sales, in terms of success. And a lot of that has to come from the top, right? So, we wish him well, though, whatever he does next. It sounds like he's retiring.
Relax, please.
Yeah.
Seriously.